For 40 years, it held the nightmares for all in New Orleans. And for 40 years, Hurricane Betsy was the storm by which all other hurricanes were measured in New Orleans. That ended in 2005 with Hurricane Katrina, and these two are actually more linked than you might think. Hi, I'm Chris May, writer, producer, and host of This Day in Weather History, now in year 2 from the Weather Network in Canada. On August 29th of 2021, New Orleans was battered to a pulp by Hurricane Ida. 16 years prior to the very day, they were drowned by the effects of Katrina. Today is the day New Orleans changed forever, however, after Hurricane Betsy. This day in weather history. Hurricane Betsy was the nastiest storm to menace New Orleans in 50 years, dating back since at least 1915. And that would stand again for another 40 years, almost to the very day when Hurricane Katrina washed ashore and then all hell broke loose. On August 27th, it was a tropical depression east of the Leeward Islands. Later that day, it strengthened into a tropical storm. And then by the 29th, Betsy had become a hurricane 200 miles north-northeast of San Juan, Puerto Rico, as its motion began to slow. It was just getting started. After the Bahamas and then South Florida, Betsy changed direction, and instead of Texas, it would go on to the Gulf shores of Louisiana in the city of New Orleans. On the morning of September 9th, 1965, this beauty of the bayou was holding its collective breath. The now powerful Hurricane Betsy had entered the Gulf of Mexico, and residents feared the worst. It was a good gut instinct because the worst unfolded. At around 10 p.m. on the night of September 10th, Betsy rode ashore at Grand Isle, just south of New Orleans. No one had ever experienced anything to that magnitude before, despite being in a hurricane-prone region. This hit hard and took everyone off guard for its strength. In Houma, Louisiana, they reported a wind gust of 130 miles per hour. That's close to 210 kilometers per hour. As is the case ahead of so many of the deadliest and most destructive storms, Betsy was preceded by a storm surge that caused immediate flooding and was compounded by the torrential rain. The calamitous coupling of these two events caused an enormous amount of damage, making this the greatest insured property loss in the United States up to that time. More on that coming up. As is also the case when looking at legend storms, they are issued a category designation at the time, but as intelligence and technology improves, they're looked at again through a better lens of consideration. Betsy has been, until 1990, categorized as a Category 3 hurricane on the Saffir-Simpson scale. However, later researchers determined that Betsy was in fact a Category 4 storm with top winds of 132 miles per hour, still around 210 kilometers per hour, when it made landfall on Grand Isle at 7 p.m. on September 9th of 65. The reanalysis reviewed wind speeds captured by planes and land stations as the storm was coming ashore, including a reading of 135 miles per hour, or over 220 kilometers per hour, that was sustained for 30 seconds. One thing that the intensity change certainly did not alter was the sheer devastation that was wreaked by Betsy. There were 75 in all who died between Florida and Louisiana, and Betsy would be the first ever hurricane to result in more than $1 billion in damages when it rang in at a staggering $1.4 billion 1965 USD. Now, so far I have reviewed meteorologically and physically Betsy being similar to Katrina of 2005. But then there is this interesting postscript, and this also ties us to the other hurricane I mentioned off the top to have demolished New Orleans, that being 2021's Hurricane Ida. One of the direct results of Hurricane Betsy was the construction of a massive flood protection system by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. This, quote, flood prevention system, end quote, was designed to prevent a repeat of the widespread flooding caused by the storm. What they designed and developed was the famous levee system that, for 40 years, had held and protected that submarine city of New Orleans. That, of course, until 2005's Hurricane Katrina, which essentially laid bare the inadequacies of that dated federal levee system. But remember again, after Katrina, the engineers got right back to it. And this time they developed the next-gen version of this fortress. And guess what? It stood strong. But before Ida, New Orleans had Katrina. And before that, it was Betsy. In 1965, this day in weather history. Tomorrow is September 11th. And although most of us will be remembering and reflecting back to the evil and cowardice attacks on the United States by radicalized terrorists, there is also a weather story to be remembered for its impact on human life. The irony here, it happened in Hawaii, the site of the only other attack on U.S. soil. Tomorrow, we will look back to the year 1992 when Category 4 Hurricane Iniki steamrolled over what would become the 50th state in the Union. On this day in weather history, with me, your host, Chris May.